One of the most infamous executions of Tudor England saw a young teenage girl, around the age of 17, who had been Queen of England for 9 days, meet her bloody end inside the Tower of London. Lady Jane Grey, also known as the 9 Days Queen, was beheaded on the orders of her Catholic cousin, Bloody Mary I. However, what actually happened at her execution, and how did she fall from grace? Today we will look at Lady Jane Grey's death, and also consider why this happened. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. In a future video, we will be covering the early life of Lady Jane Grey in detail. However, she reigned as part of an unsuccessful attempt to prevent Catholic Mary I to become Queen. She was a great-granddaughter of Henry VII, so had royal blood, and she directly inherited the crown from her cousin Edward VI on the 9th of July 1553. Edward had fallen ill in January 1553, and his health seemed to fail from then on. He wanted to ensure that his successor was a male Protestant, and because of this, he disinherited his half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth. He sided with the male heirs of his cousins as his successor, but they hadn't produced a male heir yet, so he changed his successor to become Lady Jane Grey due to her links with Protestantism. Jane would reign as Queen, but the crown could only go to a male heir. If Jane died without a son, then it would go to the sons of one of her sisters, and this was signed by the Privy Council. Because of Edward's new plan, it was a number of high-up members of court who would try to manipulate their way into power. John Dudley, in particular the Duke of Northumberland, the King's protector, had married his son off to Jane, and Lord Guildford Dudley stood in a very strong position because of this. Guildford Dudley and the Queen would have reigned as King and Queen, and Jane was 16 when she married him, with Guildford being around 18. The marriage was beneficial to both families, especially with the new law around succession, and John Dudley, Guildford's father, was now in an incredibly strong position as he had convinced Edward to pass the throne to Jane. When Edward died on the 6th of July 1553, Jane was summoned to Sion House and was then told she was to be crowned Queen. This surprised the young girl, and she became rather distressed at the time, which confused the Privy Councillors. Her distress continued until her parents and husband arrived, and it was clear that she was reluctant to take the throne. The following day, Jane, her husband and parents entered the Tower of London with their entourage on a huge procession of barges to begin preparations for her coronation. At the time, it was tradition for new English monarchs to stay at the Tower before their coronation took place. Jane wore a long green velvet dress and certainly looked like a queen covered in extravagant jewellery. She was asked to wear the crown, however at this point refused. It was quite clear that she was simply just a pawn in the political manipulations of those around her. Her husband Guildford wanted to become king, but Jane would not proclaim him king without an Act of Parliament backing it up, which infuriated her mother-in-law. Jane encountered a number of issues with her husband then, but her reign would come down to a shocking end very quickly. Her cousin Princess Mary, soon to become Mary I, wrote to the Privy Council demanding that she should become Queen, being the rightful heir to the throne as Henry VIII's eldest daughter. Many members of the council had underestimated the amount of support that Mary I had in England, and they then sent a reply backing Protestant Lady Jane Grey, telling Mary to fall back into line. This is something Mary would not do, as she had a great deal of Catholic support. She acted as a real threat to Jane's reign, and an army was sent to capture Mary. Mary then raised an army of her own, and John Dudley, who was told to capture the princess, decided to retreat. During this time, the Privy Council had a change of heart and changed their support from Lady Jane Grey to Mary I. They then proclaimed Mary Queen in London on the 19th of July, ending the short reign of Lady Jane Grey. On this exact day, Jane was then imprisoned inside the Tower of London in the Tower's gentleman's jailer apartments, with her husband being held in the Beauchamp Tower. The place where Jane awaited her coronation soon became her prison. At this time, everyone was out to prove their innocence, but Jane and her husband were placed on trial for high treason. At first, Mary I was kind and granted them both a reprieve, allowing them to remain as high-status prisoners, and Jane had a number of comforts whilst in prison. She was attended on by a number of servants and was allowed to walk inside the Queen's garden and meet with her husband. At Jane's trial, there were a number of other defendants including her husband, and all of the defendants were found guilty and were sentenced to death, including Jane. Jane's guilt was established when she had assumed the title and power of a queen when she signed a number of documents as Jane the Queen. The sentence of Lady Jane Grey was that she was to be burned alive on Tower Hill or beheaded as the Queen pleases, but was later reported to the Holy Roman Emperor that her life had been spared. However, the leniency shown to Jane did not last long. The Queen's religious beliefs and the plans for Mary to marry the disliked Philip II of Spain made her unpopular in England, and a series of rebellions broke out in the country. The Protestant Whites Rebellion took place, and the conspirators did not explicitly intend to place Lady Jane Grey back on the throne, but her father was linked closely to the rebellion. Mary then quickly realised that Jane was still a threat to her rule, and that she could not allow her to live, so she decided to offer her an ultimatum. She offered to spare the life of the young girl and her husband if they converted to the Catholic faith, but Jane refused, and reluctantly Mary was forced to order the execution of Jane in Guildford. On the morning of the 12th of February 1554, prison guards took Guildford, Jane's husband, out from the Tower of London to go to Tower Hill, where a huge crowd had gathered to witness his beheading. Jane had refused to meet him one final time due to the despair that it would have brought them both. As Jane gazed out of the room where she was sitting, she saw a horse and cart bringing the remains of her husband back into the Tower of London after he had been beheaded just outside the tower's walls. Jane saw her husband's corpse and cried out, "Oh, Guildford, Guildford." Jane, being a woman of very high status and also being a former Queen of England, was spared the execution in front of the public. For this, she was allowed a private execution within the grounds of the tower. An hour after seeing her husband's remains, Jane, dressed in black, left the quarters where she was being held, and she was escorted to Tower Green. It was this place where Jane and a number of other queens had lost their heads, and especially Henry VIII's wives. She remained calm as she walked to the scaffold and made her final speech to the crowd. She said, "Good people, I am come hither to die, and by a law I am condemned to the same. The fact indeed against the Queen's Highness was unlawful, and the consenting thereunto by me, but touching the procurement and desire thereof by me, or on my behalf, I do wash my hands thereof in innocency, before God and the fact of you, good Christian people, this day." Jane then read the Psalm 51 written in her prayer book, and turned to one of her ladies in waiting, and gave her her gloves, her handkerchief, gown and collar. The prayer book was then passed to the Lieutenant of the Tower. Up until this point, she had faced her execution with utmost confidence and bravery, and she turned to the executioner, who she would have pardoned, and said, "Please dispatch me quickly." It was then that panic set in. The executioner tied a blindfold around Jane's eyes, and she then panicked, looking for the block to rest her head on, and she could not find it, as she couldn't see. She cried out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" The sight of seeing a young teenage girl who had ruled England for a few days scrambling for the block to meet her execution must have been shocking. A witness then allegedly stepped in and helped Jane to lay her head on the block. She then spoke her last words, saying, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit," and then the executioner swung his axe, taking off the 9-day Queen's head. One swing of the axe brought an end to the teenager's life. Today, Lady Jane Grey is remembered for being the woman who reigned as Queen for 9 days, which remains one of the shortest reigns for a monarch in history. She should be remembered in a different fashion though, as it's clear that she was probably just an innocent victim in the scheming of other people, and she was a pawn who was placed on the throne. It's clear that she didn't really want the throne or to be crowned queen, and today she's considered a Protestant martyr. The story of Lady Jane Grey is an incredibly sad one, and we must remember at the heart of the story was a young girl of around 16 or 17 when she died in one of the most horrific ways possible. Once again, thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.